On behalf of the Department of English, Midnapore College, I extend a hearty welcome for today's talk to be delivered by a renowned academician and Professor Dr. Aparajita Hazra. So initially we were facing few technological glitches. Somehow we have sorted that out. So on behalf of the Department of English, I welcome you all to this online lecture series. I welcome all the participants present over other side of this virtual platform. I welcome all the faculty members of different institutions, research scholars, and also the students of Midnapore College and other institutions as well. This is our honor and privilege to have a noted academician with us today, Dr. Aparajita Hazra. To introduce her formally would take a lot of time as she has an illustrious career. So we would then like to introduce her in these few words. Initially, she started her journey at Midnapore College. Now she is a professor and head of the department of Sidho-Kanho-Birsha University, Purulia, West Bengal. She is the former dean of a gold medalist and a national scholar. She has 23rd years of teaching experience. Professor Hazra has contributed a large number of articles on various topics published in nationally and internationally acclaimed journals. She has various national and international seminars. She has been invited as guest in many educational programs, television programs. She has also been invited to deliver lectures on literature in various universities and academic staff colleges. She is the Indian collaborator of World Shakespeare Project, a global venture initiated by Emory University, Atlanta. She takes classes regularly at various universities through video conference. She has 4 books to her credit: The Art of Articulation, that got published from Macmillan; The Sorority of Passion; The Terrible Beauty; Her Hideous Progeny.
Tama, should I
Hammer.
start because I can't
No,
hear
I'm
anything.
just introducing you.
Okay.
So within a minute.
So I'll keep the phone on so that I can hear what you say. Yeah.
She has also adapted Shakespeare's Macbeth into a local dialect, Manbhum, as a project for performative Shakespeare. So it's a privilege and it's an honor to welcome Professor Aparajita Hazra, and thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation to address our participants. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Tanmay. I hope I am audible.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Good afternoon, viewers. This is Professor Aparajita Hazra here. There is a little bit of technical glitch over on my side, through which I cannot hear whatever is being said or done on the other side. I can only talk, so it's kind of like a one-way traffic. So I thank Tanmoy first of all for inviting me over. It was Tanmoy is like a younger brother to me, so whenever he invites me, I can never say no. So today I'm going to talk about, as you can see on the screen, I hope, the Abhuman and the Abject, reviewing the fin-de-siècle turn in the Gothic. Now, Gothic being one of my, places of specialization, it holds a kind of particularly dear place in my heart. So I chose to talk on the Gothic today. And as far as I remember, Tanmoy was also interested in transgression. And since transgression is one of the chief components of the Gothic, I thought that I would choose this topic. So today I'm going to talk about the Abhuman and the Abject, reviewing the fin-de-siècle turn in the Gothic. Now, I would like to start with a quotation, just to give an idea about what Abhuman sounds like. "Come," said Dyson, "we must see into this." And they went into the hall and listened in the silence. "Do you know," said Phillips, "it seems absurd, but I could almost fancy that the smell is that of burning flesh." Remember that the moment we talk about burning flesh, we begin to cringe. Continuing with the quotation, "They went up the hollow-sounding stairs, and the odor became thick and noisome, stifling the breath, and a vapor, sickening as the smell of the chamber of death, choked them. A door was open, and they entered the large upper room and clung hard to one another, shuddering at the sight that they saw. A naked man was lying on the floor, his arms and legs stretched wide apart and bound to pegs that had been hammered onto the boards. The body was torn and mutilated." I would request everybody to concentrate on these terms: torn and mutilated in the most hideous fashion, scarred with the marks of red-hot irons, a shameful ruin of the human shape. But upon the middle of the body a fire of coals was smouldering, the flesh had been burned through. The man was dead, but the smoke of his torment mounted still, a black vapor. "The young man with spectacles," said Mr. Dyson. Now, this is from Arthur Macken's The Three Impostors, which was brought out in 1895. It was the last story in the entire gamut called The Adventure of the Deserted Residence. Now, during the fin-de-siècle, which normally means the turn of the century, but normally the term fin-de-siècle is used to describe the 19th century, the turn of the 19th century. During the fin-de-siècle, a plethora of stories with human abject subjects came up. Just a few on your screen, just to name a few: Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Dickens, Bram Stoker, Robert Louis Stevenson, Oscar Wilde. There were a number of people who wrote on the abhuman at that point of time. Now, three terms, if we are to go by the title that I have given to my lecture, three terms there which need our attention. One is abhuman, one is abject, one is fin-de-siècle. Now, what are these terms then? The question is, what is abhuman? What is abject? How is the abhuman connected to the abject? And how are all these two terms connected to the third term, that is fin-de-siècle? We'll come to it by the by. Now, when we talk about the term abhuman, the first person that comes to our mind is the person who coined the term, that is William Hope Hodgson. In his story, The Way That I Did Go, I'll just give you a little bit of quotation from that story where the word abhuman has been used. But I quote, "But whether the road that led into the west, where was the place of the abhumans, should bring me to it, I had no knowing." He used it time and again. In another story called The Last Readout, he used the term again, quoting, "And now by the house of silence wound the road where the silent ones walk. And concerning this road, which passed out of the unknown lands, nigh by the place of the abhumans, where was always the green luminous mist, nothing was known." So what is abhuman? The prefix ab, as we all know, signals a movement away from something. So it means away from a site or a condition or a state of being. And so, since it's going away, it naturally means a loss or a lack. But a movement away also means a movement towards, by which we mean that if we move away from something, we naturally move towards something else. Maybe towards a site or a condition or a state of being which is still not known, unspecified, that's why. Thus, it entails both a threat as well as a promise. Threat because of the lack, promise because of what is coming forward. The abhuman subject, then, is not quite human subject, which means when we are talking about abhuman, then we mean that we are moving away from the site called human, that is human, the condition of humanness, and we are moving towards something else. That something else is unspecified, and that is where the mystery lies. Morphic variability then comes into concern. That is, there is a kind of metamorphosis in the air which is expected, continually in danger of becoming not itself and becoming thus. If myself, I am the subject, then Abhuman would mean I am not the subject anymore. I would become the other. So beings who do not conform to the normativity of humanness then are abhumans. Ghosts, ghouls, monsters, morphic creatures are of course in the sense that Hodgson used. They are the normal creatures, for want of a better word, who are normally known as the term abhuman. But the same definition, by the same logic, would also embrace a deviant, subaltern substratum of humans, whom we, in a socio-psychological way, consider outside the parameters or the paradigm of normativity. People who are like thieves, murderers, even the murdered, if the murder was grisly enough to deform the strangely overlaps the idea of abject. How is that? Abject in the sense that Julia Kristeva talked about it, of course. The word abhuman may be seen as resonating with Julia Kristeva's formulation of abjection in Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection, where she talks about what we mean by the term abject. Julia Kristeva talks about, she begins with an example of the patina on top of the glass of milk, which makes you gag and cringe because that is not having a particular taste. But the patina on top of the milk does not conform to that normativity that milk stands for, and naturally your body reflexes with a gag, trying to push it away from you. That is something that you don't want. So that is what Julia Kristeva said. So summarizing that for you, literally meaning cast away or cast under, abased. Abjection is shaded by Kristeva to describe the ambivalent status of a human subject who, on the one hand, labors to maintain an autonomous and discrete in the sense individual self-identity, sometimes even violent denial, and who, on the other hand, welcomes the event or confrontation that breaches the boundaries of the ego and casts the self down into the vertiginous pleasures of indifferentiation. To make things a little clearer, the jettisoned object, which I have put in the parenthesized term, which is radically excluded and draws towards a place where meaning collapses. So according to Kristeva, the abject means something which is difficult to explain, something where meaning in the sense of the signifiers that we understand is very important. The border is very important as far as the abject is concerned, and that is why border is also important in Gothic literature. Now, the border is a very intriguing term as far as abjection is concerned. Why? The border helps to define the limits of normalcy as a socio-psychologically accepted and acceptable discourse. Anything that goes outside that border of normativity is the other, often the abject. Anything that makes meaning collapse then is the abject. The fear of otherness, whether this be in relation to differences of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, mind, or body, is often translated into a notion of monstrosity. If we take a look at Barbara Creed's The Monstrous Feminine, she talks about this, that even motherhood can be construed as a kind of monstrosity. Personality is a key feature of Gothic aesthetically as well as stylistically, and also in relation to passion and sensitivity. The Gothic often ventures dangerously into imaginary, disorderly, and irrational territories, irrational as rational, thereby crossing the border. The discourses of human and the abject linked up with the fin-de-siècle. So we have understood what abhuman means, we have understood what the abject means. Now what remains seen as how are they connected. The 19th century is routinely thought about as the era of secularization. It is a period when the disciplines and institutions of modern science were founded and cultural authority shifted from traditional authority of religion to explanation through scientific exposition of natural laws. So a theocentric world was slowly giving away to a rational, more rational discourse of understanding the world. The sociologist Max Weber, we cannot really spoke about this process as the disenchantment of the world. The emblematic figure in this narrative is, of course, Charles Darwin, who held off publishing his theory of evolution by natural selection for years. So, for years, for fear of the religious and social disturbance it might produce. It indeed resulted in a crisis of faith for many in that age, and it was embedded in the British intellectual psyche little by little towards the last decades of the century. Now, talking about Max Weber, lecture given in 1918, he mentioned the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization and above all by the disenchantment of the world, by which he was meaning to say that because of this rationalization and because of this intellectualization, the mystique enchantment that the world was associated with has somehow gone into the folds of oblivion. Weber used the German word Entzauberung, translated into English as disenchantment, to demystify something. মানে তোমার ইয়েটা দেখা গেছে আর কি, ছবিটা শেয়ার স্ক্রিন করছি, দেখো। স্ক্রিন এসছে কি? কি লেখা আছে? হ্যাঁ, জার্মান সোশিওলজিস্ট ম্যাক্স ওয়েবার, তাই তো? চেঞ্জ করলে চেঞ্জ আসছে, তাই তো? গ্রেট। তো কি বলতে শুরু করবো আবার? এখনই তো? ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ। All right, so continuing with the lecture, I'm very sorry for the technical glitch. This is the collateral damage you have for depending so much on technology. Right, so coming back into the lecture, the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all by the disenchantment of the world. Like I said, I don't know how far you had been able to listen to me and how, when I just went off. So we were just talking about demagication or disenchantment in terms of Max Weber. But we said that the Victorian period is also of belief in supernatural forces and energies, which people do not really want to talk about because that would construe the perturbations of the collective unconscious, which is probably unable to handle the speed of the cultural and scientific changes that were happening at that point of time. Now, the religious and scientific strands of the century were closely intertwined. Every scientific and technological advance encouraged a kind of magical thinking and was accompanied by a shadow discourse of the occult. For every disenchantment, which what I mean to say is, for every disenchantment, then there was an active re-enchantment of the world. Because the advances in science were so rapid, the natural and the supernatural often became blurred in popular thinking, at least for quite some time in the Victorian era. The fin-de-siècle Gothic is positioned within precisely such an ambivalence. We were talking about liminality, we were talking about aporia a little bit earlier, and this is the ambivalence that I'm talking about now. Scientific advances resulted in a mixed bag of nostalgia for the fully human on the one hand, as understood so far, culturally, socially, psychologically, and yet an arousal by the prospect of a monstrous becoming which undoes the fully human so resolutely. Both the pulls were equally strong. One may read this obsessive staging and restaging of the spectacle of the abhumanness as a paralysis, a species of trauma, but one must also note the variety and sheer exuberance of the spectacle as the human body collapses. That's why we have a number of morphic variability like slug men, snake women, ape men, beast people, which is continuing even now in film media as well. The last decades of the 19th century witnessed the re-emergence of this defamiliarization and violent reconstitution of the human subject. The defamiliarization of the human subject as we know it, or have been knowing so far, and a violent reconstitution. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, by which we mean the fin-de-siècle, it was characterized by the ruination of the human subject in Gothic tales, often in the most violent, absolute, and often repulsive terms. Now, ruination of traditional construct of human identity that accompanied the modeling of new ones at the turn of the century. In place of a human body which is considered stable and integral and liable to no worse than the ravages of time and disease, an unstable one, by which we mean to say that so far the human body was taken to be a stable construct, which the only ravages that can happen to it are ravages made by time and disease. But nobody thought that some other kind of mutation can also be possible. Some other kind of deformity, even psychological deformity, is possible. So that is something that was unnerving at this point of time. In place of the possibility of human transcendence, the prospect of an existence within the realities of gross corporeality is what that was both fragmented as well as permeable. The relentless destruction of the human and the unfolding in its stead, the abhuman, that is going away from the human. Now, why did this happen? Now, the 19th century, why was it such a hotbed for the abhuman to be traveling its way into Gothic literature? Situating the fin-de-siècle revival of the Gothic in its new avatar as a genre centrally concerned with the horrific remaking of the human subject, the human as abhuman, as bodily ambiguated or otherwise discontinuous in identity. A general anxiety about the nature of human identity was permeating the late Victorian as well as the Edwardian culture. Scientific discourses were coming up, biological and socio-medical terms were being circulated, which were still new to the criminal anthropology made its way into society. Degeneration theory was being talked about, sexology, pre-Freudian psychology. All these things were being bombarded onto an age which was so far very religiously connected and was totally alien to all these things. Now, the Gothic invention of a systematic discourse of the irrational. This term, the systematic discourse of the irrational, was coined by Kelly Hurley, and I really love this term. That's why I could not really desist from mentioning this. So the Gothic means the invention of a systematic discourse of the irrational. Normally, irrationality is taken to be not so systematic, but it's a kind of systematic way of bringing in the irrational. William Patrick Day mentioned in the Circles of Fear and Desire that it's a kind of Gothic is a kind of precursor of Freudianism. Gothic comes first, and it is accompanied by the the psychological complexities that also found their way into Freudianism. Leslie Fiedler, I think I'll rather skip these terms because of technical glitches. I've already lost a little bit of time. We work incessantly to maintain a simulacrum of congruence between fantasy and reality, but the boundaries blur. Slips of tongue, daydreams, Freud says this, slips of the tongue, daydreams, or simply dissonance between the other people mean as opposed to what we want to hear. So there is a slip between the world of fantasy and the world of reality. And we normally try to keep it under the wraps, but it does come out willy-nilly sometime or the other, even if it's through slip of tongue or daydreams. Usually we quickly reconcile such breaches, but when it cannot be done readily, Freud tells us that this gap can call for the uncanny term, which he mentioned. He talked about the unheimlich, which we translate as the uncanny, which is often and easily produced when the distinction between imagination and reality is effaced. Now, Fred Botting, after Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula came out, he said that Gothic is dead. With Coppola's Dracula, then, Gothic dies, divested of its excesses, of its transgressions, horrors and diabolical laughter, of its brilliant gloom and rich darkness, of its artificial and suggestive forms. Dying, of course, might just be the prelude to another spectral return. Like Dracula, the Gothic keeps on dying and then keeps on coming back, the undead Gothic all the time. But the Gothic is an ever-evolving, decaying monster, dying or long dead and then reviving often when it is almost like corpse-like. Gothic has transmuted and faded a number of times. So transgression is Gothic's lifeline. Apart from that, repression is something that Gothic deals with. Gothic is often propelled by a perpetual cycle of repression, triggering a return of the repressed, followed by the repression's return. Catherine Spooner, in the preface to P. Howell Cherry and C. Ruddle's 21st Century Gothic, asserts, dominant mode of the 21st century, it increasingly seems, is Gothic. A lot of people also talked about it. Angela Carter also in the 1970s, she said that it seems that we are kind of like living in the Gothic times. So Gothic is not dead. Fred Botting needs to be countered on that effect. The fin-de-siècle of the 19th century saw a surge in the methodology. In 1882, a group of earnest intellectuals founded the Society for Psychical Research, or better known as SPR. They aim to investigate the claims of mesmerism, spiritualism, and authenticated true ghost stories. So though Max Weber was talking about a disenchantment that happened in this era, there was a lot of enchantment, it seems. They did so by developing an extraordinary jargon of psychical research that fused the latest advances in physical and psychological sciences with their hopes for proof of a super or supra-mundane world. The society called Haunted Houses, this is a kind of mouthful of a term, phantasmogenic centers, and theorized mediumship as the result of telepathy or sublimity as unknown psychical faculties. This is a pamphlet that came out at that point of time. You can see over here, they talk about table moving, its causes and phenomena. So people were talking about seances and table moving. I'm not sure whether I'm still in.
Yes, ma'am. You can continue, ma'am. You can continue.
Am I still audible? Someone? Okay, okay, great, great. Oh, I just felt like something is wrong. All right. So I just made sure whether so 1852, American medium Mrs. Hayden came to London to conduct seances with many of the people in the society. The 1880s, this is a very well-known picture. London became home to the Russian occultist, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The medium for dictations from the Mahatmas who provided the basis for her Theosophical Society. Now, this is a symbol of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was formed in 1887. What did these people do? It was a secret society devoted to the study and and the early 20th centuries. I'm showing you how what Max Weber had said, that the age had lost its enchantment. It was a disenchanted age. Was not really very true. Though scientific advances were occult, the interest in the occult, the interest in spiritual things like seances and table moving was also very much there, which accounted for the revival of the Gothic once again. In 1848, a new religious movement called the Spiritualist movement emerged. The Fox sisters were there. The three sisters, Leah, Margarita, who was also known as Maggie, and Catherine, who was also known as Kate. The Fox sisters claimed to have come into with them by loud knocks on few years, because they started this rapping for one rap for yes and two raps for no kind of thing during seances. This very local sensation triggered up the spiritualist movement. These were the three Fox sisters, Leah, Kate, and Margarita. Early psychical might owe itself to the fact that his brother, William James, was a leading light of the SPR, which means Society of the Psychical Research. Writers like Robert Louis Stevenson are thread in the context of the SPR. Now, these are some more pamphlets that were making the news in that point of time. So, Magic by Professor Anderson. This pamphlet promises to teach its middle class to the Victorians' fascination with magic, science, and the supernatural. This is Anton Mesmer, Franz Anton Mesmer, who set up a craze for mesmerism, which in miraculous medical cures could only supposedly be affected by manipulating the invisible beings. Illustration of a woman. This is how mesmerism would be conducted. And as you can understand, that books had been written about that. This is from the book called A Key to Physic by Ebenezer Sibley. Influences. Now, when something happens in one part of the world, and newsletters and newspapers and the media head influences on the and founder of the Review of Reviews. Now, this is a picture of the Pall Mall Gazette and the Review of Reviews, but our concern is not with these two newspapers, but with this one, Borderland. In 1893 century, in which news about ghosts and spirits and seances and astrological predictions, psychical research findings would mingle with breakthrough news of breakthrough in chemistry and physics, almost as if same platform. Definition of degeneration at this time as a pathological deviation from an original type in his book in 1857. Now, crime or transgression, which is one of the main things of the Gothic, was coming up in a big way because crime, thereby transgression from normalcy, if we look at crime in that way, was coming up as grist for the amusement mill at the point of time. Crime was becoming amusement. In Blood, an article from Punch magazine in 1842, it was written, and I quote, "We are a trading community." This is from the editor. "We are a trading community, a commercial people. Murder is doubtless a very shocking offense." Just give me a moment. Right. So they want to say that prediction. Yeah, I've already done this. Yes. So this is from the editor who says, "We are a trading community, a commercial people. Murder is doubtless done, is not to be undone. Let us make our money out of it." So that's the very straightforward kind of logic that if murder is already done, we know that it's shocking, but if we can't undo it, then why not make some money out of it? So look at the pamphlets, look at how murder is advertised, because that is what would make the papers sell. So murder was a transgression that was becoming entertainment little by little. The unnatural sensationalized news of murders. In murder, you ask for the epithets and all the sensationalizing epithets would be used. Examination and committal of Annette Mayer's murder of Henry Tucker in St. James. Now, this is a picture in a book. This is a man who is going to be executed and he's crying because he's giving his last dying speech. And on the other page, you see some men, they are running away with a big smile on their faces with the clothes left back by the dying man, the old clothes. This is a satirical cartoon. I'm sorry, the picture is not very clear. I took them all from the internet. Satirical cartoon from the publication by the magazine Punch. Over here, you can see how murder and execution is being staged over here. In 1828, a body was discovered in a shallow grave. 1828. It was that of Maria Martin, the local mole catcher's daughter, and the details came out with gory, salacious alacrity. She had left Polstead to marry a farmer named married another woman dressed as a man for her elopement, and her stepmother said she had a miraculous dream. Look at the way things are sensationalized. She had a miraculous dream which led the villagers to discover the grave. Street peddlers immediately started selling broadsheets, known as broadsides at the time, and ballads on cheap printed sheets, providing the public with all the gory details. Even another mode of entertaining audience through relishing of transgression. So this is the pamphlet advertising the marionettes. This was how they picturized the barn where she was found. The Greenacre murder was another such murder which was sensationalized at the point of time. Greenacre was a notorious murderer who in 1836 dismembered the body of his fiancée, Hannah Brown, cut off the head from the body and carried it by bus to the East End Canal where it was found later. Great crowds gathered at Newgate to see the hanging as if it was kind of like an entertainment. Memorability. Commissioner William Calcraft was notorious for a short drop on the rope, meaning his victims took a for the audience. Awful, inhuman, barbarous murder of a female, as if that made the murder even more, Life of the Mannings. This is another execution that was really salivate century. Maria Manning was a Swiss lady's maid married to an unemployed railway worker. She also knew Patrick O'Connor, who was a kind of loan shark. So he had given some money and he wanted that money back. Soon he was found dead, very rare. And so the double executions, the executions themselves were very sensationalized. And now there was a woman who was going to be executed. So this was even double pleasure. Thus, this created a sensation. Up to 2.5 million broadsides and pamphlets were sold. Report says that one journalist had, where he used to be going around in tatters. But after the execution and after the sale of pamphlets, he got all kinds of new dresses for himself. A broadside seller advertised his sheets with an illustrated coconut who was washing his hands before the meal. The people said, "Oh, look at him washing himself. He's doing it so natural." Natural means natural. And ain't a thing. Sold seats at their windows and on their roofs for up to 2 guineas each. Herman Melville, the novelist, he also said that, recorded in his diary, that he had a companion had paid half a crown each for a stand on the roof of a house adjoining the. So it was, all in all, a most wonderful, horrible, unspeakable scene. So what I'm trying to point out to you is that transgressions, abhumanity, if transgressors were supposed to be moving away from the normativity of humanness, they are the abhumans. But abhumans became to be celebrated in this age. Look at the pictures that came out at the point of time. Here are 2 people getting hanged. Now, Jack the Ripper was another phenomenon at that point of time, because nobody knew who he was and nobody knew how many deaths he had managed to, 8 of them. The date they began or the date they ended, nobody knew anything about him. And the more the mystery, the more popular he became. So many at a time and since have suggested, following Stevenson's lead, that the murderer was an outwardly respectable, read, middle or upper class man. This is important because at that point of time, R.L. Stevenson had brought out his story of Jekyll and Hyde. So there was this notion that a person who is very genteel on the outside could be very evil on the inside. So this duality, this morphic variability or abhumanity of the human mind was something that people were taking stock of. Now, even in the Illustrated Police News, this Jack the Ripper made the headlines at that point of time. Another victim is found, Jack the Ripper murdered. Now, contemplating the murderer, William Palmer, the doctor who was also convicted of murder, he was a doctor, but he was Dickens once said that when but cruelty, covetousness, calculation, and low wickedness. And then he said that a murderer who looked like a murderer was better. But a murderer who looked like a, meaning to say that a murderer who looked like a gentleman was very difficult to tackle. So Dickens said because of his outward gentility camouflaged with the evil within. This is something that is difficult to negotiate. But outward respectability and inner corruption is a respectable teacher, but he nevertheless plans a murder. The mystery of Edwin Drood, John Jasper is a model citizen, a choir master, but he's also a murderer. The Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson, of course, I just alluded to this, the strange case of first 6 months, it was so popular. But the play of Jekyll and Hyde was closed down when it was transformed into a play because it was considered to be too evil for the normal human mind. But the idea of outward respectability housing inner corruption had already begun to stick. In fact, in August 1888, the most famous adaptation opened with Richard Mansfield in the double part. He transformed himself from Jekyll to Hyde, by changing his posture, his gait, right in front of the audience. So when 3 weeks later a prostitute was found murdered in Whitechapel, many people connected Stevenson's outwardly respectable Dr. Jekyll and the murderous Mr. Hyde with the invisible East End killer. What they meant to say is that the killer might have been inspired by the newspapers gradually came to refer to that unknown murderer as just Mr. Hyde. Now, this was Richard Mansfield. This is a picture photograph with double exposure where you find one form here and the other form over here. So this was the transformation that he would come across. Now, as a result of this transformation, which was so lifelike, one of the public, one person from the general public even sent a letter to the police saying, "I should be the last to think because a man take a dreadful part, he is therefore bad. But when I went to see Mr. Mansfield take the part of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I felt at once that he was the man wanted. I do not think there is a man living so well able to disguise himself in a moment." So this was the letter. People thought that maybe Richard Mansfield himself is the person behind all this. And just after that, Bram Stoker was writing his Dracula. So many parallels can be found between Jack the Ripper and Dracula. Like Dracula had 5 brides, Jack the Ripper had 5 victims. The doctor in Whitechapel, a man was arrested just for friends form what Stoker in his notes called a vigilance committee. And in Whitechapel also, to stave off Jack the Ripper, the Mile End Vigilance Committee patrolled the streets. The East End was home to thousands of Jewish immigrants. Much of the reporting had a heavily anti-Semitic tone to it. The crimes, said the East London Observer, were so vile they must have been done by a Jew. So this was the So there was a lot of anti-Semitism going on towards the east end of London. And here was Bram Stoker saying, this is a manuscript of Bram Stoker's Dracula, saying that Dracula's estate was located near London on the east side. So these parallels were there. Now, if we talk about Dorian Gray, in the picture of Dorian Gray, then Oscar Wilde was also using this, motif of abhumanity lurking underneath a very human facade. Gray's biography follows a ripple-like private life, because Dorian Gray had a very different kind of private life that was totally not to be understood from what he looked like on the outside, the discreet and very genteel outwardly appearance that he had. Abstractions that came out of all this are then these: otherness, alienation, violence, despair, and the Gothic above and all that. Now, other transgressions were also there, and this is what accounts for the advent of the abhuman, the advent of the abject in the revival of the Gothic during the fin-de-siècle. Transgression, which was kind of like, I won't say celebrated, which was much in the news, and literature drew from it. Like novels such as Oliver Twist have made Victorian child thieves very familiar to us. The misery of becoming deviant. Now, of death in the metropolis. So he talks about how juveniles were brought every other day to Old Bailey to be tried, because they were of a child pickpocket, where at a public execution. So an execution is taking place, and a child is quietly, carrying out his agenda of pickpocketing. Now, a young pickpocket strikes. You can see the pickpocket, drawing out, and peculiarly, these pickpocket little boys, they were bent on stealing silk handkerchiefs, which was very rare in that at that point of time. And these silk handkerchiefs they would take away, they would bring to one place, gather in a heap, and they would sell them. And oftentimes, the gentleman from whom it would so happen that the gentleman from whom they stole the handkerchief would come to the same pile of handkerchiefs to buy his own handkerchief back. So this would often happen at that point of time. Heather Shore, in her book The Artful Dodgers: Youth and Crime in Early 19th Century London, says sensational stories of crime and violence filled the pages of the popular press after 1800 with details of. There were these men called ladsmen. In Charles Dickens's Fagin, almost reminds us of that. Ladsmen, who were actually criminal bosses, who trained young boys to steal and then later sold the stolen goods. Thomas Duggan was one such a notorious person. Charles King was another. Isaac Ike Solomon was another. Now, Juvenile Trials, this was a moralistic children's book that tried to tell children that you should not be like this. So, but the children would take a lot of pleasure from listening to these stories of transgression all the same. This book, Child's First Tales, was written as a Sunday school reward book, written by the Bronte sisters' headmaster, William Carus Wilson. He was the headmaster to the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Annie. Now, these are three reports of, this is a 15-year-old boy, Joseph Mee, who was charged with pickpockets and brought to Old Bailey for public execution, for trial, for pickpocketing during a public execution. This was a little boy, Robert Spencer. He was doing his business at Greenwich Fair in 1835. Heather Shaw talks about another, a lot of trials that used to happen at this point of time. Old Bailey proceedings. In reality, death sentences, pickpocketing was considered to be a crime which was no less than any other crime like murder. So children would even be given death sentences for this. But In reality, death sentences bestowed on children were almost always commuted to lesser sentences like transportation on the grounds of leniency. So, almost by the 1830s, almost 5,000 prisoners, little children, some of whom were as young as 10, were carried by ship to penal colonies in Australia, where they would work as labor to serve sentences for 7 or almost 14 years and occasionally for life. Now, the Time reports in 1831, the last execution of a juvenile in England was probably only of this young boy called John Anybird Bell. In 1831, he was a 14-year-old who committed a cold-blooded murder of a 12-year-old boy during a bungled robbery. Now, whipping and flogging were often there. Whenever we read Oliver Twist, or even when we read the Bronte sisters, we come to know about this. Now, pleading at the bar, it was criticized. This punishment of children was critiqued in a very vehement way. Letter to the Times newspaper also talked against little children being punished like that. Oscar Wilde, when he was put into jail for indecency, that is what is often said, he also wrote about how children are tortured in jail, and children were often stashed into the same cell with adult offenders, which would leave disastrous results behind. Then came the penny dreadfuls. This was another form of the Gothic that really popularized these transgressions. To gather up all these transgressions from reality, to create abhuman abjects in the Gothic mode on paper. And owing to the propensity of the reading public towards sensationalism, they became very popular, the penny dreadfuls. How popular? In 1830s, increasing literacy and improving technology saw a boom in cheap fiction called penny bloods. They were not called penny dreadfuls at the beginning, they were called penny bloods for the working classes. In the 1860s, they were renamed penny dreadfuls, and each number, they came out weekly, and each number or episode of 8 to 16 pages told stories of all sorts of transgression. Between 1830 and 1850, there were almost 100 publishers doing this penny fiction thing. Now, these are some of the pictures of penny fiction. Phyllis Flanders in the Victorian City Everyday Life in Dickens's London. This is a very nice book, very detailed. The illustrations were an essentialist element, illustrations like these. They were an essentialist element because, as much as an advertising tool as art, one regular reader was someone hung up, burning over a fire, and some would go mad if they couldn't learn what he had been doing or who he was and all about him. And the illustrators were advised more blood, much more blood, because that is what would go, and that is what would go sell. So more the abhuman nature, the more the transgression, the more the penny dreadful would sell. The most successful penny blood, and what might possibly be the most successful series in the world that has ever seen, were the Mysteries of London. First appeared in 1844, written by G.W.M. Reynolds, which went on for almost 12 years. The new motif in this series was a little change. That is, instead of the completely fictional figures, this time the penny dreadfuls started drawing from real life, which was even more terrifying. Later, after highwaymen and then evil aristocrats fell out of fashion, people grew out of them, penny bloods found even more success with stories of true real-life crimes and murders. Bloods turned the perpetrator protagonists into demonic, abhuman characters to titillate the taste of the working class. One example was Sweeney Todd. Even you also have a movie which has been made in the recent years, or the demon barber who first appeared in a blood entitled The String of Pearls, which showed the murderous barber killing his clients for his neighbor Mrs. Lovett to bake into meat pies on the road to world fame. The grisly tale would sell. This is a story. This is a picture of Mrs. Lovett. This is her pie shop, and this is the demon barber. still there? How do I know? আছি তো না বেরিয়ে গেছি অলরেডি? Okay, okay. So I'm still there, right? Okay, how much more time do I have? I'll wind up soon. Okay, right. Yeah. So yeah. So talking about the penny dreadfuls, the mystery of London, the most successful penny dreadful. This was one of the best that was to be found at that point of time. And mind you, even the Bronte sisters, when they were writing, when Emily was writing Wuthering Heights, or when Charlotte was writing Jane Eyre, before their Angria and Gondel days, before their Juvenilia, that is when they created the kingdom of Angria, when they created the kingdom of Gondel. The penny dreadfuls were something that they would read quite regularly, and they would request their father Patrick Bronte to bring them whenever he went to town. So these were extremely popular. The Mysteries of London, the most successful penny dreadful, drew inspiration from the streets of London. So what we are seeing now is that instead of the fictional characters, which kind of like distance you from real life and makes it more acceptable or more easy to tackle because it's not real. Now this is coming into real life now. They are taking up episodes from real life and turning them into the Gothic, which means that you understand that this Gothic has happened. So it's very real. It's more terrifying. The beginning of detective fiction comes up because slowly, detectives came into play. In the first penny dreadful that brought in a detective was The Boy Detective, and these are the pamphlets. Because time is short, I'm going to skip through some of the things. Now, the police force was brought into play at this point of time, but they were not really very well accepted because, within this is 1929, parishes within 12 miles of Charing Cross. Whenever we talk about Charing Cross, we remember Sherlock Holmes. So Charing Cross saw the first new police on the streets within 8 months. Just need to check whether right. So like the red coated army, this was civil, not a military force. So this police was clad in blue, but they were not really very well taken, and they were nicknamed the Blue Devils, raw lobsters. Why raw lobsters? Because lobsters are bluish gray when they are raw, but the moment you fry them in oil or you heat them up, they become red. So the meaning was that these policemen clad in blue were actually named civil, but the moment the heat comes up, that is the moment a crime occurs or you do something wrong, they turn red, which means the army. So they turn as cruel as the army, and they were also called the bludgeon men. Until 1842, the police force was entirely dedicated to crime prevention. But there was one point of time when they took a long 10 days to solve a crime, and then people understood that detection was very important too. So what is today known as Scotland Yard was formed at that point of time. At that point of time, it was only an 8-man detective department, which was lodged in a place called, the address of which was Scotland Yard near Whitehall. But slowly it came to be named as Criminal Investigation Department, or the CID. This was in 1878. Okay, so leaving this digression apart, literature imitated or reflected life. Let's have a few examples. Charles Dickens, in his novel Bleak House, created Mr. Bucket, Charles Field. These are some of the people who, Franklin Blake in the Moonstone, he plays the detective. In Ruth the Betrayer, Ruth Trail is a female detective. I think I'll skip through this because these are a little bit of digression. So human or abject characters in literature reflected the fears and anxieties that the fin-de-siècle of 19th century was going through. How? The representation of the abhuman in fiction has in fact always been a way of iterating contemporary fears through the Gothic. Even early Gothic novels like Horace Walpole, when he wrote The Castle of Otranto, or Anne Radcliffe, The Mysteries of Udolpho, they dealt with Catholic noblemen who were dissolute, corrupt, pervert monks. So the contemporary fears were voiced through the Gothic. Later on, in the early Victorian period, 19th Novels like Oliver Twist, Bleak House use the Gothic imagery as a means of drawing attention to the social ills afflicting the poor in the modern in the contemporary London. Understandably, urban slums with their dark labyrinthine streets and seedy areas of vice and squalor supplanted the ivy-clad castles and catacombs of the Walpole-like horror. Later still, in the Victorian fin-de-siècle, the mise en scene shifts from the physical landscape. This is more terrifying because it shifts from the physical landscape that provides the location for erstwhile Gothic tales to a more disturbingly the human body itself. Resultant works: Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde's, sorry, the apostrophe should have been here, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, Bram Stoker's Dracula. The focal point in all of these books was that the human mind and the body changing and developing, mutating, corrupting, decaying, the rise of the abhuman, and the evolutionary, social, and medical theories that were emerging at that time. I think I'll skip this because time is very short. Actually, what happened is I'll just concentrate on the last part. You know, when Darwin wrote The Descent of Man, in the last chapter of The Descent of Man, he writes that humans are descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped, which in turn had evolved through intermediary stages from some amphibian-like creature, and now this in the lay mind turned into a kind of nightmarish phantasmagoria. Thus, the assorted, disparate assemblage in the birth of Frankenstein's monster. The descriptions of Mr. Hyde as ape-like and troglodytic in Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, as if the brutal and uncivilized Mr. Hyde is a ghastly evolutionary precursor to the Dr. Jekyll. Evolution initially appeared logically to always lead to physical and mental improvement because we know about the survival of the fittest. But it was soon understood that evolution is a mechanistic process with no guiding hand whatsoever or no objective, ultimate goal, and therefore it was argued by people like H.G. Wells. In certain circumstances, retrogression was also possible into less complex forms, as was just as likely as progress into more complex ones. So H.G. Wells, who had studied under the biologist T.H. Huxley, examined in his essay Zoological Regression, which came out in 1891, the curious case of ascidians, more commonly known as sea squirts. This is a very common picture taken from the internet of ascidians. What he said is that these organisms initially have a well-developed tail, enabling rapid progress through the water. But that tail subsequently regress into creatures capable of nothing more than attaching themselves vegetatively permanently to a rock, thereby becoming merely a vegetative excrescence on a stone. Thus, in Time Machine, set far in the future, Wells imaginatively applies a similar level of evolutionary decline onto humans to create what could be called abhumans. The unnamed time traveler discovers that in the year 802-701 AD, the human race has evolved into the Eloi, the leisure class, grown elfin and effete through idleness, and the other class, that is the Morlocks, the decayed working classes living underground, brutal, predatory, and afraid of the light. This is the film version that was brought out by George Pal. Fiction has become. This was a sketch of the abhumans. So, drawing on the theories of evolution, criminologist Cesare Lombroso, he proposes that criminal behavior also, owes itself to this scientific fact of evolution. He cites examples from literature. He says, Mr. Hyde's troglodytes, the Siecle Gothic, and as someone who is unacceptable in polite society. So whoever is unacceptable is then the abject. And this abjection then, according to the criminologist, is known through the abhuman way in which the entity looks. The fact that Dr. Jekyll, who is highly respected, and Mr. Hyde, who is social outcast, happen to be one and the same person, makes a dangerous statement on the location of the abject. This implication that the criminal who lures might provide no real indication of the personality within, rendered Jekyll and Hyde a particularly disturbing work, as it reiterated the inseparability of the abject from the subject. The picture of Dorian Gray also does the same thing. The Gothic imagery of the abhuman and the abject, given its fantastical nature, allowed authors to explore in an indirect fashion themes that were not necessarily acceptable subjects for discussion in a respectable society. I don't know whether I should go on into all these things. I'll leave these things. I'll just come to this before I end. Similarly, Mr. Hyde, whose appearances incite disgust, I'm taking this from the book, disgust, loathing, and fear. Incidentally, Julia Kristeva, when she talked about abjection in her Powers of Horror, she used these words: disgust, loathing, fear, to describe the abject. So, disgust, loathing, and fear in the staid lawyer, Mr. Utterson. Let's quote. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any need, borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. And he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him: loathing and fear with which Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, regarded him. So he is the abject. Elaine Showalter gives a new dimension to this, and she says, contextualizes this in a reading of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and says that this is a fable of the fin-de-siècle homosexual panic. Because at that point of time, homosexuality was rife in discussion, and people were mostly against this, and they thought that this is an aberration, a transgression that would create abhumans out of the humans, caused by the discovery and resistance of the homosexual self. Helen Vaughan, this is a very famous story, Arthur Macken's short story, The Great God Pan. Helen Vaughan there, a murderous result of a barbaric scientific experiment from sex to sex. She sometimes becomes a male, she sometimes becomes a female in nightmarish fashion, mutating rapidly from male to female and back again, thereby becoming the abhuman. This particularly dark and disturbing idea can be read as an attack on the new woman, the label for the confident and independent females who emerged into society during the, notwithstanding the feminist first wave movement that was going on at the point of time, and looking forward to the likes of Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir, who would come towards the middle of the 20th century. Even with these new women, they were looked at as mannish, sexually threatened. A lot about the queer theory and all that. She writes prolifically as well. Ventures that homosexual panic underlies the entire genre of the paranoid Gothic in the Great God Pan. Incidentally, Israel Law Amendment Act of 1885 made homosexuality illegal, and this Arthur Macken's short story was being brought out in 1890. So it was well after the wind up now, because I know that other speakers are waiting and the audience is also waiting to listen to them. I should not eat into their time anything anymore. These are the anxieties of the fin-de-siècle. Thank you very much for your patient listening. I still don't know whether I am audible because I can't hear anything
Yes,
on my
ma'am. Yes,
screen.
yes. Thank you, ma'am.
So I'm just talking into
Thank.
the screen and hoping to goodness that I am audible to everybody. Hope you
Yes,
like the
ma'am.
lecture. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
ma'am.
Thank you, Tonmoy.
Thank.
Uh,
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
So,
Have a
thank you
good
for
evening
this
and let's continue with
all
the
research
webinar.
presentation. The more I can say that it was full of information and really all researched. And one more thing, like I like to say that the
I don't
way
know
the
how many
enthusiastically
questions.
you present, you are giving us time and you are enriching us by your presentation. That is really we are amazed at. Now we'll quickly proceed to our next session. Professor Chandrava Chakravarty, ma'am, from West Bengal State University. She has joined us already. So we'll move to that session. And for that, I request my colleague, Professor Sangita Khanna, to introduce ma'am formally.
Yes, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Department of English, Midnapore College, I heartily welcome you all to the second session of this online ongoing lecture series. It's a privilege and honor for me to say that this evening we have with us an eminent academician, Dr. Chandrava Chakravarty, as our speaker, who is going to speak on the topic Tagore's Red Oleander and the Vision of Transcendence. But before she starts with her lecture, I would like to formally introduce her to all our participants. Dr. Chandrava Chakravarty is a professor and head in the Department of English at West Bengal State University. She is also the director of the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media at West Bengal State University. Professor Chakraborty was awarded doctoral degree on the study of gender-culture interface in 18th century British literature. She has obtained the Charles Wallace India Trust Scholarship from UK for undertaking her doctoral research. Apart from that, her research interests include literature of the long 18th century, 19th century Bengal, gender and cultural studies. Among her recent publications are the monograph Gendering the Nation, Identity, Politics, and the English Stage of the Long 18th Century, published by Orient Black Swan in 2013, Relocating Tagore's Binodini, New Spaces of Representation in Rituparno's Chokher Bali, published in 2013, Glimpses, a selection of poetry and prose, and India Weaves, a selection. She has also edited a volume of essays titled The New Woman in Tagore, The Making and Unmaking of Female Subjectivity in 2017. She is also actively involved with the designing of textbooks for elective and English courses for graduation and post-graduation levels under the prescribed CBCS curriculum of University Grants Commission. Now I humbly request Dr. Chandrava Chakravarty to please deliver her address. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. I congratulate the English department of Midnapore College for organizing such a lecture series and also for inviting me to be a part of it. I have decided to speak on Tagore's Red Oleander today because the play is part of the syllabus, and I felt that my reading of the play might be of some use to the students. This lecture is about the dynamic relation between place and space in Rabindranath's play, Raktokorobi, and how this dynamism translates into a transcendent vision of immensity, a term that I have borrowed from Gaston Bachelor. The plays of Rabindranath have been mostly conceived as elusive, philosophical, and hence more impressive as closet plays than theatrical performances. One of the reasons could be the way Tagore manipulates various spaces in the plays to create a complex visual and ideological register that makes enactment a challenging task. This means that various places or locales are spatially interpreted, and the place space binary is often dissolved to produce a vision of sublime grandeur or immensity. The play Red Oleander is amenable to a post structuralist understanding of spatiality as an indispensable component of uh, social existence and offered profound insights into the themes that Tagore repeatedly evokes in his plays, such as human greed, power, justice, the value of common human experience, and freedom. Tagore's radical experiments in drama distinguished his plays from the colonial Bengali theatre and established a tradition that is distinctly Tagorean. By placing him in the context of the Bengali theatre of his time, we would acquire a better understanding of how the manipulation of the place-space dichotomy had radicalized contemporary theatrical conventions in Tagore's plays and strengthened the thematic and ideological imports of his drama. The Bengal Renaissance, impacting the cognitive and cultural life between 1795 to the last quarter of the 19th century, was much more than an enthusiastic assimilation of Western culture into native culture. It was prompted by the desire to search for a cultural identity and escape the ignominy of colonial subjugation. The search for an enlightened self by the Bengali Bhadralok or gentlemen spawned several theatres in the 1850s. The wealthy Bengali elites or the Babus and the Western educated middle class turned into promoters of art and culture and started with the productions of several English plays with English and Bengali actors. The Oriental Theatre, established in 1853, produced several performances of Othello, Macbeth, Merchant of Venice, and Henry IV. In 1857, Joyram Boshak, a Bengali Babu of North Calcutta, established his own playhouse and produced a few noteworthy Bengali plays such as Kulin Kulo Sharborsho, Kirti Bilash, and Bhadrajul. The search for one's own roots made the Babu community turn towards Sanskrit plays. The Bengali Babus did not support the Sepoy Mutiny, but appropriated the nationalist spirit of the mutiny by trying to reclaim an essentially Hindu past from which they had been historically estranged by Islamic rule. The works of the British Orientalists were picked up by the Bengali scholars to construct a past which would liberate them from an ignoble present. The self-fashioning of the Bengali intelligentsia was contingent upon antithetical trends characterizing their hybridity. On the one hand, we have Sanskritic revivalism, and on the other hand, there is Westernization. If the colonial Bengali theatre restored the tradition of the Sanskrit theatre and its theoretical treatise, they also emulated the conventions of the colonial Western theatre, drawing from Aristotle, Racine, Cornell, Goethe, adapted the Western conventions of act and scene divisions, theatrical props, and the proscenium stage. The Tagore family indulged in several theatrical performances and created a context for Rabindranath to acquire a taste for theatre. Rabindranath's ideas about drama, as gleaned from varied sources, delineate a trajectory in which his convictions shifted from the Western model of mimesis to an understanding of drama as essentially metaphorical. Tagore is rightly observed by Pavitra Sarkar, liberated Bengali theatre from narrow provincial themes like Kulin system, widow remarriage, sati, etc., even historical and mythical narratives, and embraced themes of universal significance. In the preface to Bhagno Hridoy, Tagore writes, and I'm quoting, "Drama is like a flowering plant. It has not only flowers, but also root, stem, branches, leaves, and thorn. The present poem is a garland made of flowers collected from the plant." Now, it is difficult to surmise what Tagore actually meant by this description and how he understood the relation between plot, character, conflict, metaphor, and life. He nevertheless made it clear that he has perceived a fundamental difference between drama and poetry, the reason why he insisted that Bhagno Hridoy should be read as a Gitikabbo or a musical poem and not as a play. He himself felt from time to time that the lyricist in him had acquired primacy while writing plays. In the introduction added to Raja Urani in 1929, Tagore wrote, "The play has been inundated in lyricism, as a result of which It has become weak as drama. It has turned into the marshland of poetry, unquote. He was also convinced that while the appeal of poetry is to the imagination and emotions, drama has a special quality. It is essentially visual. However, he tried to resolve this dualism between the lyrical and the dramatic in plays such as Sharadotsav, Raja, Daghor, Ocholayaton, Phalguni, Muktodhara, Raktokorobi, and Kalir Jatra. In these plays, Tagore combined the Aristotelian notion of conflict operating at the level of plot with the effusiveness of poetic emotions. The plays are much more complex in their depiction of social problems than can be explored within the limits of lyric poetry, yet they also become highly poetical in their combination of the concrete and the abstract. Dramatic conflict is produced by the contest between the real and the imaginary, the particular and the universal, the finite and the infinite. In Natyamancha Natyaroop, Pavitra Sarkar divides Tagore's plays into three categories. The first are the plays which deal with the relation between individuals. Second, those between an individual and ideology and social institutions or systems. And third are those dealing with the individual and nature. The play Raktokorobi belongs to the second category. It is about the individual's conflict with social systems, dominant power, and hegemony. The problems are intensely real, not only for a particular time or place, but for human civilization since time immemorial. Hence, the particularities are dissolved in universalism, the finitude of events in their symbolic infinitude. Rabindranath never composed purely realistic plays. Even in plays inspired by the Shakespearean model, such as Malini, Raja Urani, or Visarjon, poetry dominates, and the imagination of the spectator is set free from the specificities created by props and scenes. As a producer of theatre, Tagore was convinced that the form of his drama created room for a rare kind of pure dramatic experience, intensified by the resonance of poetry and metaphor. He was more keen to communicate the emotional and ideological content of his plays and began to minimize the use of concrete backdrops for the actions on stage. This was aimed at reducing the difference between life and art. The figures of Thakurdada in Raja and Sharadotsav, the Boiragi in Muktodhara, the Baul or Bishu Pagla are Tagore's instruments who invoked in the audience a desire for what is eternal, true, and humane. Tagore anticipated the potentiality of spatial representations and applied it to delineate the dramatic world of his plays. In Raktokorobi, the sense of time is completely disavowed. He categorically claims that the events of Raktokorobi are beyond the constraints of temporality or history, nor do they have any specific location or local. Muktodhara does name two places, Uttarkot and Shivtarai, but the exact historical time or place of action remains non-specific. Instead, there is a sense of juxtaposed spaces and a set of relationships between them. There is still another space, distinctly Tagorean in its primacy over the external world. This is the interior location of the mind, the seat of Atma-Shakti, which transcends the politics of the external domain. In relation to the Tagorean conception of the inner space, I should particularly extrapolate from Bachelor's The Poetics of Space, where Bachelor primarily speaks of two kinds of spaces, intimate space and exterior space, that keep encouraging each other in their growth. Tagore's domain of Atma-Shakti, which resides in the intimate inner space of the mind, is the source of infinitude or boundless freedom. Bachelor, in The Poetics of Space, explains his concept of immensity thus, and I'm quoting, "Immensity is within ourselves. It is attached to a sort of expansion of being that life curves. However paradoxical this may seem, it is often this inner immensity that gives real meaning to certain expressions concerning the visible world." I'm tempted again to turn to Bachelor's concept of inner immensity while talking about Tagore's perception of the Oshim or the infinite. And Bachelor says that in this activity of poetic speciality that goes from deep intimacy to infinite extent, united in an identical expansion, one feels grandeur welling up. Immensity, marked by grandeur and freedom, makes the intimate mind space and the world space blend into an expansive oneness. In Prokritit Pratishodh, Tagore wrote, now here I shall refer to a passage. I will read the first two lines from the original Bengali passage and then I'll turn to my own English translation. This is from the original passage. Khudroke loihai brihat, shimake loiyai oshim, premke loiyai mukti. প্রেমের আলো যখনই পাই তখনই দেখি সীমার মধ্যে সীমা নাই. The minuscule forms the enormous, the finite is embedded in the infinite. Love paves the way for emancipation. Whenever my soul is illuminated with the light of love, I realize that limits constitute the limitless. The beauty of nature is not a figment of my imagination. It harbors the sublime pleasure one derives from confrontation with the boundless. The play Rokto-Karubi is about the conflict between sovereign power on the one hand and human freedom on the other. It uses mechanization as a trope to reify the otherwise elusive and diffuse concept of disciplinary power that curbs and throttles the expressions of human freedom. The play builds its visual and ideological import on the juxtapositions of places marked distinctly as spaces. Now, spatial juxtaposition of two places or locals forms the mechanism to which two worldviews clash and contend. As Foucault tells us, we do not live inside a void. We live inside a set of relations that delineate sites which are reducible to one another and absolutely not superimposable on one another, unquote. Now, in the introduction to Rokto-Karubi, Tagore clearly explains how he visualizes the various sites or spaces for staging the plays. The location is imaginary. It is a fictitious kingdom of Mokor Raja named Jokkhupuri because of its treasure trove. In Hindu Puran, Jokkhupuri is the kingdom of Kuber, the god of wealth. Hence, the metaphorical significance of Mokor Raja's domain cannot be overlooked, encouraging us to read the play as an allegory of human greed. However, Tagore asserts that this play is based in reality. Readers will be deceived if the responsibility of collecting evidence to prove whether the event has occurred anywhere is placed upon historians. Suffice it to say this much, that according to the poet's knowledge and belief, it is completely real. Just as Tagore dismisses temporality by locating the events of the play at a non-specific point in human history, he also refuses to grant the events any particular geographical site and tells us it is possible that geographers will have differences of opinion regarding the actual name of the place of occurrence. But everybody knows its nickname is Jokkhupuri. The stage direction written by Tagore clearly points to how the playwright envisions special relations. He says that the Raja lives behind an extremely complex screen. That netted screen of the palace is the only scene in this play. The entire action occurs on the outer portion of the screen. So space of action in the play is divided into two major arenas, a space of power, secluded and estranged from common life, and a space of dramatic events that occur in the world of the subjects of Mokor Raja. But within these two major spaces, there are several micro spaces, creating final lines of divisions. The most intriguing figure in the play is the character of Nandini, who wears a band of red oleander or Rokto-Karubi in her wrist, and whom the king has captivated, as Tagore tells us, within the story net of the play. She is the only character who traverses both the spaces, for this girl, it seems, will not allow the barrier behind which Mokor Raja stays to endure. As rightly articulated by Malini Bhattacharya, Nandini is not an airy configuration of the essential feminine, but a herald of a momentous turn of events. Rabindranath uses the nature-culture binary and the dynamics of sites or spaces in Rokto-Karubi to encourage a universal reading in the context of a set of historical events which pained him and threatened his faith in humanity. This lends meaning to Tagore's claim that the imaginary Jokhopuri and its events are essentially real, and the conflict between Uttarkut and Shiptarai in Muktadhara, the eternal conflict between oppressive forces and the spirit of freedom. If Bishupagla and Dhananjay Boiragi are the philosophical linchpins of such a spirit, Nandini in Rakta-Karabi and the Jubaraj of Uttarkut in Muktadhara are the harbingers of freedom. The concept of mukti or freedom has diverse and profound connotations in Tagore's works and is not merely restricted to his disillusionment with Western civilization and its aggressive materialism. The poet-playwright has envisioned a more profound relation between man and nature, the individual and the world. He writes in Bisheshatto Bisho, and again I do the same, read the first two lines from the original Bengali passage and go on to and then I'll move on to my English translation. মানুষের এক প্রান্তে তার বিশ্ব, অন্য প্রান্তে তার বিশেষত্ব। এই দুই নিয়ে তবে তার সম্পূর্ণতা, তার আনন্দ। Man has the world on one side and his individual self on the other. The two taken together make him complete and happy. If the happiness of man resided in the gratification of his selfish desires, then he would have lived in a separate world of his own creation, governed by his own laws. Man would be defeated if he lives in an illusory world of his own making. If I'm disappointed to think that the world of nature does not obey my wish, I must realize that his freedom from the individual is the reason why it gives me joy. We call the world Bishyo because it never obeys the Bishesh or the particular. And that is why the individual finds his place in the world. Tagore's thoughts resonates with what Foucault later formulates as the ethics of care and self-making. Care for the self became a focal point for individual freedom in Foucault's thinking in his later works, and for developing positive relationships with others, and also for an ethical participation in politics. This self-care occurs at the bodily and mental level. If we look beyond social and judicial constraints and see ourselves in relation to the cosmos, the perspective tends to change. Recognizing man's limitation as a minuscule component of the cosmos and questioning one's socially formed limitations are the first steps towards building what the Greeks called an ethos, one's ethos, and its continuous improvement has essential permanence in one's practice of the care for the self. In modern terms, ethos translates quite obviously into ethics, which is one's personal philosophy of morals and values. For the Greeks, one's ethos was the means by which individuals related to themselves and others. It was also a means of opposing and preventing absolute and coercive power. According to Foucault, power exists everywhere in every human relationship, and the individual, oppressed or not, conscious about these power relations or not, always participate in what he calls power relations. But for Foucault, power relations exist when all parties involved have certain degrees of both individual freedom and power over the others. When an individual loses this freedom in this power relation, it is called a state of domination. Seen from this angle, practicing care of the self allows one to exercise control over one's own self and also over others. Foucault sees care of the self as being an essential component of individual freedom, and he clarifies in his essay, The Ethics of the Concern for the Self, the risk of dominating others and exercising a tyrannical power over them arises precisely only when one has not taken care of the self and has become the slave of one's desire. We'll see the parallel between what the Makoraja says to Nandini and what Foucault writes here. I'm not suggesting, of course, by any means that Tagore's works have been influenced by, or Foucault has been influenced by Tagore's works, but I'm drawing certain parallels in the history of thoughts that bear very close resonances, albeit marked differences. Tagore was writing at the backdrop of against the backdrop of the World War, and he was keen to seek a spiritual resolution of for the world's crisis. While Foucault framed his ethics of care in a postmodern world in which he saw everything as relational and perceived freedom in relation to power and governmentality. Although the historical context and the paths are different for these philosophers, yet both perceived the ultimate development of the self necessary to resist domination. Since the antagonism between nature and culture again is very strong in Roktakorbi, I would like to turn to Tagore's ponderings over the Topobone that echo the need to cultivate a close relationship with nature to achieve a state of spiritual liberation. Such a mental state facilitates a perception of the world that is purely spiritual and makes it appear sentient to human beings. Almost in Wordsworthian vein, Tagore talks about the educative function of nature. And he writes about his ashram school at Shantiniketan that the sky here seems penetrated with the voice of the infinitude. Rabindranath also felt that the dubious character of colonial modernity resulted in a deadly disavowal of agrarian ways of life and its simple pleasures. His critique of Western colonialism saw imperial power concentrated in such spaces as statecraft, technology, and economic strategies. Thus, in Roktakorbi, the seat of sovereign power, discipline, and control are reified as scientific technological devices or systems. Contrarily, places where the life of common human beings manifests itself in close relationship with nature become heterotopic. In Roktakorbi, the song of Posh, Posh to the Dagdietse or Posh is calling you all, occurs as a refrain to assert the value of ordinary human activities as opposed to the obsessive mechanisms that characterize sites of power. Even at the end of the play, when the king joins Nondini to free himself from the iron chains of his own power, the song of Posh is played in the background. The song marks the triumph of freedom over oppressive power and asserts that the flow of common human life, like the free-flowing water of Muktadhara, is irrepressible. It thus celebrates the spirit of Ranjan, whose physical death only marks the transcendence of his spirit, the victory of the Oshim over finitude. This makes Nandini not just the eternal feminine or an allegory of nature, but the very daughter of man. By tearing the screen of the Raja, she sounds the clarion call to a battle in which humanity defeats an inhuman, mechanized civilization. The most interesting feature of Roktakorbi is that the space of power behind the screen generates forces of its own destruction. The Raja's power is self-destructive because it spawns innumerable clones. The Shoddas in the play are agents of sovereign power, but they turn out to be more dangerous and uncontrollable. The space of sovereign power is also immensely lonely and, and suffers from pain. Nondini, the voice of Makur Raja, the disembodied voice of the Raja, one day tells Nondini, one day in a distant country, I saw a very mountain just like myself. From outside, I just couldn't make out that all its rocks pined inwardly. Late one night, I heard a horrifying noise, as if some demon's long suppressed nightmare had suddenly broken. In the morning, I saw that the mountain had sunk underground from the force of an earthquake. I understood from seeing that mountain how the burden of power crushes itself, unknown to itself. And in you, I see something which is its opposite. And Nandini asked, what do you see in me? The voice says, the dance rhythm that plays on the flute of the universe. If the Raja belongs to a restricted, lonely place behind a complex screen, Nandini belongs to the universe. It is not difficult to discern the covert links between Tagore's spatial organization of two modes of life and consciousness in the play, and the binarism between the East and the West that he emphasizes as part of his nationalist consciousness in several writings. While acknowledging the material supremacy of Western civilization, Tagore locates the core of India's greatness in its spirituality. The Upanishadic worldview enables him to see a close connection between man and the cosmos as against the restrictive logic of Western modernity. While the scientific rational worldview of Bacon and Newton reduced the universe to a huge machine governed by certain rationally explicable laws, the Upanishad invests the universe with a sentient divine entity which connects with the human and the non-human. In the essay My School, Tagore writes, it is pitiful to have to scramble for small pittances of fortune. Let us live for the ultimate truth, which emancipates us from the bondage of the dust and gives us the wealth. Uh, not of things, but of inner light, not of power, but of love. In neither Rakta-Korobi nor Muktadhara do we have the Topobon. Yet, the oppositions between nature and the man-made mechanized civilization forms the central conflict in the plays. The conversation between the invisible Maharaj and Nandini unfolds this contrast. The Maharaj says, I crush the creator's intelligence. I want to snatch all that is hidden in the heart of the world. It's the weeping of all those ripped up lives. Either I possess or I destroy. Nandini says, in reply, let me finish singing my song to you. And the song is very interesting. It is a song which belongs to the Prem Porjay, Bhalobashi, Bhalobashi, Shei Shure Kache Dure, Jole Stole Bajay Bashi, Bhalobashi, Bhalobashi. Tagore is foregrounding the notion of love here as a cosmic force, as a cosmic concept, which permeates the natural world. We have similar iterations in several songs that is written, such as, Ei je tomar prem o hridoy horono, ei je pataয় আলো নাচে সোনারো বরণ, or for instance, তাই তোমার আনন্দ আমার পর, তুমি তাই এসেছো নিচে, আমায় নইলে ত্রিভুবনেশ্বর, তোমার প্রেম হতো যে মিছে. Nature is a space, therefore, that can resist the aggression of a materialistic, imperialistic civilization. And so Nandini is as simple and as powerful as nature. Tagore's philosophy of the world is intimately linked with the idea of a personal ethics of freedom, based on a spiritual awareness of the self, rejecting the commodity fetish of an increasingly materialistic way of life. Tagore writes in the essay to the child that the cheap and the vulgar have come to make our mental atmosphere dense. We have come to the point where we are about to lose our infinite, the infinite of our space in our life. Disciplinary power in the play is organized in several sites or pockets of control, and it has specific targets or subjects in mind. And this mechanism estranges man from the infinite of our space, quote unquote, by slaving his soul. In Rakta-Korobi, I said before that there are several microsites of power. One such is the tunnel of the Vajraghar, to which recalcitrant subjects are submitted. Disciplinary power works by partitioning, enclosing, codifying space, enabling the detailed management and training of conduct by organizing the movement of bodies in space and through time. Foucault's exemplary figure of the proliferation of disciplinary power is the panopticon, which is a precise arrangement of physical space to secure the automatic, depersonalized, and anonymous operation of power. It is important to note that if the panopticon is as a figure for disciplinary power suggests forms of governing at a distance, then power relations operate through self-regulation rather than the direct application of force or coercion of the body. We find in Rakta-Korobi that even knowledge, embodied by the professor, is made subservient to dominant power. His courage and conscience are lulled to sleep. The Goshai is another hegemonic agent, one who uses no force, but hauls disarmed, half-dead men to his group and forces them to sing kirtans. The Sardar tries to contain Ranjan within the apparently insurmountable confinement of the Vajraghar. But Ranjan is the very force of freedom that coercion produces. And that is why the chains of Vajraghar cannot hold him back. He comes as the harbinger of freedom, of life, that lies beyond the codified norms of Jokhopuri. There is also in Ranjan an element of the subversive energy of the carnivalist. He laughs at the Sardars, makes fun of the controlling mechanisms of Vajraghar, and turns a place of oppression to a place of merriment. The headman complains about Ranjan's insolence. He says, the man knows no form of fear. When the slightest tone of discipline touches our voices, he immediately bursts out in loud laughter. If questioned, he says, solemnity is the mask of stupidity. I've come to take it off. Ranjan then asked the excavators to engage in an excavating dance. It is also impossible to keep him tied down to one place, for despite the chains around his body, he sleeps from Vajraghar to Kuberghar. The headman exclaims worriedly, nothing can hold fast to his body. Amazing are his abilities. If he stays here a few days, the excavators too won't heed restraints. Tagore sees freedom as the expansive capacity of the soul, as a rebellious energy that ultimately brings mukti. Even Maharaja is scared of Ranjan because he stands for an enlightened consciousness. While the Raja's agents of domination could not subjugate Ranjan's spirit, the Raja, who has only mastered the art of destruction, kills him without knowing that the defiant young man is Ranjan. When Nandini implores him to bring Ranjan back to life, the Raja laments, I have learned the magic of Yam. I cannot awaken, I can only destroy consciousness. The center of power is presented in the play as a sad, lonely figure, a captive of his own coercive structure, and finally a puppet of the power that he himself typifies. Hence, the Raja yearns for freedom more than anyone else in the play, and Nandini becomes the agent of his salvation. When Nandini invites the Raja to a battle, the Raja says that he will join Nandini to battle against me. But keeping your hand in my own hand, can't you understand? That battle has begun. This is my flag. I break its stuff. You tear its banner. Let your hand come into my own hand and kill me. Kill, utterly kill, and only that will be my salvation. Power, which thrives on exploitation, disciplining, and surveillance, can destroy itself not from active rebellion, but from a change at the level of consciousness. The Raja, who has killed consciousness for long, now awakens to a new level of awareness, to realize that death is not an end in itself, but a gateway to a state of death-defying transcendence. This is a spiritual insight which is Upanishadic and not Foucauldian. The idea of mukti is spiritually nuanced in Tagore. It connotes freedom from the gyre of temporality, a state of being in which the particular mingles with the universal. The Bishesh becomes a part of Vishwa. Dr. Korobi conveys this awakening to a new level of consciousness by dissolving locational specificities only to evoke a space of self-realization and recreation. This is perfectly commensurate with Tagore's idea of the symbolic function of drama. Thank you very much. If you have questions, you can ask me, or maybe you can also mail them to my email address, which is available from the university website.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
So it's time for the question answer. So I request our participants, if they have any question in their mind or thoughts, they can write them down in the comment section of YouTube. Then we'll bring it out. Or in any case you are not able to connect as we are facing technological glitches before ma'am's lecture, so somehow you got disconnected. In that case, so you can write them down to me and I will convey them to ma'am, or you can write directly having ma'am's mail ID. You can mail ma'am directly. So, ma'am, I can see we are not having questions here right now.
Yes.
So, Songitati, are you here? Songitati. So, it's time for the formal vote of thanks, and thank you, ma'am, once again. Yes, Songitati.
Thank you very much for having me also. We can't hear her. I think her sound is muted.
Yes. Thank you so much, Pam, for such wonderful academic discourse. And now, as we are moving towards the end of our session, I think I would like to just request our one of our student, Tithi Banerjee of the Department of English, Midnapore College, to please give the formal vote of thanks. Tithi? Yes.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir. First of all, good evening, and to all people present here. And I, on behalf of Midnapore College and the Department of English, would like to thank our distinguished lecturer, Professor Chandrava Chakravarty, for conveying such an amazing and enlightening lecture on the topic Tagore's poet Oleander and the vision of transcendence. And I would like to thank our respected principal and our respected HOD, Professor Tanmay Kundu and Professor Sangeeta Konar for taking an initiative in a hard time. And last but not the least, I would like to thank our wonderful participants for making this whole thing happening and for their lovely cooperation. And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Tithi. And thank you, ma'am,
Thank you,
once
sir.
again for giving us this precious time out of squeezing out this time out of your busy schedule. As you are the head of the department, we can understand well how much stress you are having right now to exam is going on. Exam is not going on, but you are to promote the students to the next semester. And if we talk about Midnapore College, we are going to start our classes of next semester from tomorrow onwards. So thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for having me on board. Thank you very
So
much.
we are having questions right now. So as we have ended with vote of thanks, so I will convey them to you, ma'am, through mail.
You can ask the
Okay.
students or whoever wants to ask me any question to write them straight to my mail.
Okay.
I can answer them. I can write them elaborately. Instead of
Okay.
routing them through you. That will be easier for me.
Oh, okay, ma'am. Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.